So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Pernane Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch. And this evening, we're taking a different approach than usual in our webinar series. This evening is a workshop. We're going to workshop a draft paper that Northwatch has produced, Securing the Future, a risk-reduced approach to nuclear fuel waste management. So our objectives are really to share not just information, but also share thoughts, responses, questions, perspective on this challenge of reducing risk with nuclear fuel waste management. So our objectives are to consider different approaches to waste management, identify what's needed in long-term secure management of nuclear fuel waste, and workshop Northwatch's draft approach. And I really do appreciate so many joining us for this session this evening. So we're going to start with an introduction problem statement. We're going to do an overview of work to date on extended on-site storage, and then we're going to review elements of Northwatch's draft approach, the paper as it currently stands, and then summary and next steps, and certainly we'll have a question and answer or discussion period as we go to summary and next steps. So this is a workshop. It's an invitation to contribute ideas and criticisms. Be kind, but criticisms. We want to test the idea, pull at the fabric, not just of the draft paper that Northwatch has prepared, but the other ideas that are going to be presented as well in this workshop. It's not a technical workshop. It's not an expert presentation. I'm not an expert. And our paper is not a finished product, although some of the papers we're going to look at first are finished products. And I will be in follow-up. I did say there will be homework. I will be in follow-up, sending out a list of papers and resources, and also a questionnaire. That's the homework. So the problem is the nuclear power industry in Canada has produced 3.2 million bundles of nuclear fuel waste. This is highly radioactive nuclear fuel waste to date. And the volume is expected to double, perhaps more than double, with the announcement of the Pickering refurbishment, which was not part of the projected inventory, but projected to double over the next 30 years. So the fuel inventory that we're in this inventory, it's the fuel waste from the commercial operating reactors and the research stations operated by the research laboratories operated by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited at Chalk River and White Shell, and also those early prototype reactors, Douglas Point, the nuclear power demonstration project at Ralston, and Gentil in Quebec at the Gentil site. The status of the used nuclear fuel inventory that we're looking at this evening is more than a year old. Normally, for many years, every year, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has prepared and presented a nuclear fuel waste projection on an annual basis. In 2023, they didn't produce that report, which is perhaps part of an overall trend with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, where they are producing or making available fewer papers in recent years than previously. And of the papers that they are producing, fewer of those papers are actually publicly available through their website. But this is a significant, loss, I think, because we did use this inventory every year to track the fuel inventory and also to track Ontario Power Generation's progress in transferring the waste from dry storage from wet storage to dry storage. The fuel is hottest, most highly radioactive when it first comes out of the reactor and it goes to the irradiated fuel bay. But we were seeing, when we first started monitoring this about 10 years ago, we were seeing that Ontario Power Generation was moving much more slowly than they described themselves as moving in transferring that waste from the irradiated fuel bay to dry storage. And we can see on the chart that's in front of you you can see that they've been doing some catch up. And when I looked at it last year, I think we noted that that catch up was particularly evident at the Pickering site. And that's a positive. I didn't do the calculation this year because we didn't have this year's numbers. But we expect them to move to a point where there is no waste in the irradiated fuel bay older than 10 years, and they're not there yet. So what's wrong with the status quo? What's the interest in moving to a different approach, and that approach being making the waste more secure at the reactor station? So in Canada, as I just mentioned, the fuel has been staying in the irradiated fuel bay, at least in Ontario, for longer than the projected period. There's also problems with the irradiated fuel bay. There's decay, some deterioration rather, and some migration of radionuclides, radiocontaminants from the irradiated fuel bay into the surrounding area. There's also the dry storage containers, and the dry storage container buildings have not been publicly demonstrated to be sufficiently secure. We did attempt to do technical reviews of the dry storage containers and buildings a number of years ago, and actually had retained technical experts to assist, and weren't able to get enough of the actual specifics, the specifications. Our technical experts said that there simply wasn't enough information available to come to a conclusion that the containers, the container design, the building design was sufficiently robust. Ontario Power Generation has approvals, and we'll look at some overhead shots in a couple of minutes, and I'll point that out, but they have approvals from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to construct additional dry storage buildings immediately on the waterfront of Lake Ontario at both the Pickering and Darlington station. And, we take issue with that, as do others, including people living in Durham region and Toronto area, where they're subject to the risk associated with that. So 9/11 and then Fukushima both raised concerns about the security of the waste, and the security of the waste, particularly in the irradiated fuel bay. There's no approved or operating deep geological repository anywhere in the world. That's industry's preferred option and has been for decades, but there is no approved or operating DGR anywhere in the world. And the Canadian plan for a DGR is a set of concepts stitched together. The industry calls it adaptive phase management, but there's no social acceptance. And the technical case hasn't yet been presented or made to support a deep geological repository. And if NWMO's plan for a deep geological repository were to move to operations, the waste would remain at the reactor sites for at least 65 years in its current configuration. And that estimate is prior to the announcement 2 weeks ago of the Ontario government's plan, commitment, financial commitment to refurbish 4 reactors at the aging Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, which would add about 10% more to the volume of the fuel waste already in storage in Canada. So that would also extend, the Pickering waste had been projected according to a concept report by the NWMO from 2021. The Pickering waste was to have been final removal from the site by 2050. Very, very ambitious, and I don't think a realistic date, but that was the NWMO's date. That would be pushed on by approximately 50 years. So we're looking at then having the waste at the site for another century with the Pickering refurbishment. And then, of course, there's the notion of building 4 so-called small modular nuclear reactors, boiling water reactors at Darlington. So the waste will be at the reactor sites for a very long time, let's say a century with these new developments. So we've looked at a number of technical papers we've been looking at this for about a decade. And I have on the screen just the collection that we looked at most recently as I was reviewing the paper and preparing for the workshop. So we're going to look more closely at 3 of these, and I'll provide the links to all 5 of these documents. But there has really been a very active discussion internationally, which Canada, I would observed several years ago, Canada wasn't really engaging in. This discussion became very active, I'd say, particularly after Fukushima, and Canada was just not active in the discussion. So in the paper that we're going to be talking about at the end of this evening is Northwatch's draft paper, Securing the Future, a risk-reduced approach for nuclear fuel waste management. And it's evolved over the years. It was first, the content first was developed as part of submissions to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission when we were intervening on the waste management facility relicensing. We've done that for both Pickering and Darlington. Then we submitted it to Natural Resources Canada during the radioactive waste policy review, and then again to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development as a submission on nuclear waste governance. And this is the first time we've workshopped it. We've had it reviewed and commented on, but this is the first time we've workshopped it. So I really appreciate, again, your time and your thoughts and your input on it. The first resource I'm going to point us to is one from the US, and it's really one that I think that we've taken some guidance from, and it's an idea, a position developed by a large group of safe energy groups in the US. And this is the posting by the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability. And it's for hardened on-site nuclear waste storage. And there are 2 basic premises. One is that the hardened on-site storage would keep spent nuclear fuel as close as safely possible to its point of generation, thereby exposing fewer people to radiation. The other really fundamental principle is that it would move the waste from the irradiated fuel bays into dry storage on a steady schedule. And those are 2 objectives that I think we share in Canada. I think that the hardened on-site storage paper is developed in response to the specifics of the US situation. So we're going to look tonight at a couple of papers that are also Canadian specific. But I think the Haas principles are very helpful, and I think set out really the foundations for a whether we call it hardened on-site storage or more robust on-site storage or extended on-site storage. The notion is to make it more secure, to reduce risk, and to avoid long-distance transportation. So the first paper we're going to look at tonight is by Dr. Gordon Thompson, and it's storage of spent nuclear fuel at the Pickering site, risks and risk-reducing option. And this is a paper that was commissioned by Ontario Clean Air Alliance in 2018. And it focuses on the Pickering site and begins just setting the basics, providing a basic orientation to the used fuel containers and dry storage systems at the Pickering site. So they're in commercial type structures, not fortified, and their primary functions are weather protection and radiation shielding, although largely weather protection. And the assumption is that the dry storage containers within the storage building, the dry storage containers provide the shielding, and the building provides the weather protection. Each building has a concrete slab, and a lower portion of the building is precast concrete panels, and they do provide some radiation shielding. And the upper portion are simply metal panels. And you can see by the image in the upper right, it's a fairly standard. The documents tell us it does meet Canadian building standards, which is excellent. Storage of spent nuclear fuel at the Pickering site, looking at some of the risk-reducing options. And Dr. Thompson really focuses in a lot of his work on security risks and responding to minimizing, avoiding the risks associated particularly with malevolent acts, with terrorist attacks. And you can see by the placement of the waste at Pickering and Darlington adjacent to Lake Ontario that there is a certain vulnerability there. He identifies a number of measures that could reduce their passive systems, meaning they don't need ongoing inputs of energy and other resources. That's one of the issues with the irradiated fuel bay, is they do require their active treatment, their active containment. So they have to have ongoing inputs of water, and they have to be maintained. There has to be an electrical supply to them continuously. So if there was a loss of water, a loss of power, then the irradiated fuel bays would lose water, and there would be potential for a catastrophic event. So in the features that Dr. Thompson identifies, it's passive safety. They could deter attacks, and they incorporate protective deterrence into the design. And the risk posed by the facilities could be substantially reduced, not eliminated, but we're talking about risk reduction. And this is just an image from 2017 from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And you can see that the Pickering site is, I think, the most challenging of the Canadian, certainly of the Ontario sites, because it is tightly packed, very close to the water's edge. And you can see here, G, that is the new additional dry storage container buildings that were approved, and those are additional future dry storage container buildings. So immediately on the waterfront, immediately on the shoreline, and certainly within sight line from Lake Ontario, which creates a vulnerability to extreme weather events, but also to malevolent or terrorist activity. And now we see the Pickering site. This is just a Google shot from the same time period. And you can see the other challenge with the Pickering site, and thinking about the refurbishment and extending operation for another 30 or more years. You can see the close proximity. It's an extremely densely populated area. And it's challenging because there's not really that much room to grow, to move from that site. So it's a challenging site. And Dr. Thompson did work on some design features or for reconfiguring the site. And he looked at, first principle is that this has to be a package deal. It has to be done as part of a process of risk assessment. The adequacy of the existing dry storage containers, and I would add the buildings, is one of the issues that has to be addressed in the design process and as part of the risk assessment. The reconfigured facility would be located at the Pickering site at the north end, north of the reactors, on land currently occupied by the electrical switchyards, which you may have seen in the image. And then he adds some features, some trenches surrounding the vaults. It's a vault system. Potentially the vaults might be separated from each other by berms, which is a feature of hardened on-site storage, is that the waste is dispersed, and there's some berming to create barriers between the storage systems. And then after decommissioning of the reactors is completed, there's a potential for the land to be returned to unrestricted access, the land surrounding the continuing waste management facility, if there was the necessary level of decontamination. So some of the other features, it would be freestanding, above ground, attack resistant, reinforced concrete vaults, would be covered by layers of gravel and rock. There would be a boundary structure around the facility. It would be partly reinforced concrete, that boundary structure, and partly a gravel and rock berm. The boundary structure would form a continuous perimeter, except for one access point, which would have some chicanes, some impediments to easy access to the site through that one portal. And the boundary structure would be higher than the vault roofs. So we do have an interview with Dr. Thompson, and I'm going to attempt to share that with you. It's not always my smoothest. I'll try that again. Thanks for your patience. Requires a number of clicks. And I think we're in business. So Dr. Gordon Thompson is an executive director at the Institute for Resource and Security Studies in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he does technical and policy studies on issues related to sustainability and global human security. And he's done many studies on risks associated with nuclear facilities and on options for reducing those risks. So Dr. Thompson is here with us to discuss risks arising from the storage of spent fuel at the Pickering nuclear site in Ontario. And he wrote a report on that subject in 2018. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Thompson. We'll just go straight to our questions. Tell us what's happening with the spent fuel at the Pickering station now.
Hi, Bernane. Well, at Pickering, there are 8 nuclear power reactors. The first of them entered service in 1971. And so they're pretty old. They've been running on and off throughout that entire period. And they're constantly generating spent fuel. Spent means the fuel is no longer useful to produce power. It's intensely radioactive and produces heat and has to be guarded. Initially, it's stored in pools underwater, and then it's transferred to dry storage containers. By the end of this year, 2024, projections are that there'll be about 3,000 of these containers stored at Pickering. Each of these containers is a large steel and concrete cask, and each one contains about 380 fuel bundles. So by the end of this year, we're looking at a total of about in excess of 1 million fuel bundles.
And is the Pickering situation unusual, or is that?
Well, let me just go on a
Sure.
little bit. There's no current option for removing this spent fuel from Pickering. And this is common for nuclear power plants around the world, in terms of your question about what is usual. Only one country in the world is actually building a repository, an underground repository for radioactive waste, and that's in Finland. There is no repository in Canada or in the United States or anywhere else. So the practice at nuclear power plants around the world is to accumulate the spent fuel on site. And in the case of Pickering, the Canadian Waste Management Organization says that the waste could be there for at least 90 years. And given past histories of radioactive waste programs, it could be much longer than that, potentially hundreds of years or even indefinitely.
So what are the risks with having the spent fuel? What are the spent fuel risks at Pickering?
The quantity of radioactive material is quite impressive. The casks I described through the end of this year could hold about 90 tons of plutonium. The average nuclear warhead operated by a nuclear weapon state contains 3 to 4 kilograms of plutonium. An amount of 10 kilograms is sufficient for a non-state group to build a nuclear weapon. So we're talking about amounts of plutonium at Pickering, thousands of times greater than needed to create a nuclear weapon. The amount of radioactive cesium in storage at the end of this year will be in excess of 10,000 petabecquerels. A petabecquerel is a unit of radioactivity. In the Fukushima accident of 2011, about 6 petabecquerels fell on Japan. Substantial areas of Japan are still unfit for human occupation. 6 petabecquerels, and Pickering will hold about 10,000 or more of these units. So we're talking about truly massive quantities of radioactive material and weapons-related plutonium. And the question is, how might this material be released? And there's 2 broad options. One is just general degradation, institutional degradation over the decades of storage, and physical degradation of the materials. And the other risk area is attack, to release material at the site or to take it away and release it somewhere else for a malevolent purpose, as a crude nuclear weapon or as a radiological weapon. And again, we're talking about decades with potential degradation of site security, maintenance, and the physical nature of the casks themselves.
Mm.
So in broad terms, those are the risks.
So how could those spent fuel risks be reduced at the Pickering site or other sites, but looking at Pickering, how would we reduce those risks?
The short way of saying it is hardened on-site storage, HOSS, which is a familiar concept nowadays to many environmentalists. What this would mean at Pickering is to build a large fortress-type structure on the site, which would be much more secure and long-lasting than the lightweight buildings that the licensee is currently using, intends to use. Constructing this fortress structure would be greatly facilitated by early decommissioning of Pickering station. Contrary to the current plans of refurbishing 4 of the units for decades to come, which is a foolish idea on multiple grounds. This fortress structure would be a constant reminder that this is an unsolved problem. Waste would no longer be out of sight, out of mind, sort of hidden in a nondescript shed on the site. It would be visible to all, and it would be vastly more secure than is currently the condition. So that, in a nutshell, is our option for risk reduction at Pickering.
And I'm having to click through from current slide. Oh, I seem to have lost my spot. Apologies all. So now we're going to move on. Many thanks to Dr. Thompson for joining us, albeit remotely and briefly. Now we're going to look at our other Canadian source, and perhaps surprisingly, the source is the Nuclear Waste Management Organization itself. So in 2002, as part of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was required to look at 3 options: continued storage at site, centralized storage, and deep geological concept as per the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited concept. The Act set that out, and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization did carry that out, although, you know, at a somewhat desktop level. Nevertheless, they did do a study of extended storage at site. There were a number of studies done, and they did one study for the Ontario sites, one for Quebec, one for New Brunswick, and one for the ACL sites. And we're going to look now mostly at the Ontario sites, but this is from the overview paper that outlined conceptual designs for extended storage. And in that paper, they set out that extended storage can be defined as permanent or indefinite storage. And they did confirm that extended storage could be used indefinitely. The implementation of reactor site extended storage would involve a location for the extended storage at the reactor site. The reactor site extended storage facilities would be designed to allow safe retrieval of used nuclear fuel from the storage at any point during the service life of the facility. Some countries, for example, France, has a requirement that their deep geological repository approach must include retrieval, the option of retrieval. In Canada, we don't have such rules, and certainly we don't have a rule like that requires that. And the NWMO says very, very generally, well, it'll be, you know, we can retrieve it until it's closed. But when you consider the conditions that will be created in that underground repository, you're going down 600 or 700 meters along a quarter, 1,000 meters in a room 250 meter deep, stacking the storage, they're calling them buffer boxes. That environment will be so highly radioactive that workers will not be present. They're working on developing a system of placing the used waste using robotics controlled from either the service junction or from surface, because it'll be too highly radioactive. So in the absence of any actual definite method described by the NWMO to retrieve this waste, I think that we need to conclude that the waste will not be retrievable. A feature of the extended on-site storage as described by NWMO's consultants is that there could be safe retrieval at any point. So in the general paper, the consultants described three systems: storage in casks, storage in vaults, and storage in silos, three different approaches. In the individual studies produced for each set of sites, for Ontario, they identified casks, vaults, and casts in shallow trenches. Quebec, vaults, surface modular vaults in shallow trenches. New Brunswick, silos, modular vaults, vaults in trenches. And ACL, silos in storage buildings, and silos in shallow trenches. So, you know, some common approaches and some unique to each area. This is a list of the studies that were produced, and I will include this in the follow-up email that I send after this evening's session. These are the illustrations provided in one document, one supporting document, and they are graphic depictions. And you can see that they're not fully realistic. If you remember the Pickering site and how densely populated it was, you see the image on the left, and it doesn't really resemble what we would expect at any of the reactor stations for extended storage on site. But on the right, you see they've combined the casks and vaults in storage buildings. So this is, I think, probably fairly similar to the status quo arrangement. Another arrangement is in what they call storage chambers in the one document, the document with illustrations, but they call trenches or shallow trenches in the documents that are specific to each set of reactor sites. So you can see that that is designed for both. They're illustrating both for casks and for vaults. It's a shallow sort of at surface, slightly subsurface. It's essentially at surface with a soil covering. So providing some additional covering, particularly, certainly removing from sight lines potentially. And then there's a third option in the illustration, which doesn't appear in any of the reports for Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, or the ACL sites, the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited sites, now known as Canadian Nuclear Laboratory sites, although still owned by ACL. And that is the option of casks in rock caverns. So this is not a deep geological repository. This is a shallow rock structure, perhaps not dissimilar from what the NWMO has as an add-on for their DGR site. So they have an add-on, what they call a interim option for shallow storage or shallow caverns, which was in their 2005 plan that they presented to the federal government and appears now in some documents, and other documents it does not. It often appears, when it does appear, with an asterisk saying not contemplated as part of the current plan or something to that effect. So this is perhaps similar to that, but this is intended for as part of their suite of options for at site, for extended storage at site, although they don't associate it with any of the sites that they prepared reports for. We're going to look in more detail at the sites for Pickering, Bruce, and Darlington. And again, we're looking at options that would provide extended storage, and that extended storage could mean permanent or indefinite storage with necessary maintenance and facility repeats. A facility repeat means basically replacing the structures, the built structures of the facility. So the dry storage buildings or the vaults or whatever structures are being employed. So they identify that there's both the casks in storage buildings, surface vaults, or the trenches, so either above ground or partially below ground. And these are the estimated or assumed service lives for the facility components. So you can see they go from 50 to 100 to 300 years. So the processing building they have as 50 years, and that assumes that it's subject to a program of preventative maintenance and repair, is the note that they attach to that. But it's not clear why the processing building is of a more limited period than, say, for example, the storage buildings. But those are their assumed service life. We just pulled out of the report some of the features that they assign to the extended on-site storage systems. And as we go through, I expect that I'll follow my impulse to flag which of these are not present in a deep geological repository approach as being proposed by the NWMO. The first is retrievability. As we discussed, the NWMO has a generic statement that doesn't eliminate the possibility of retrievability, but nor do they present any method for retrieval. So with these storage systems, it will be possible to retrieve the used fuel from the cask or from the vault, from the storage system as necessary throughout the life of the facility. Each of the different approaches have shielding associated with them. The storage casks, it's the same level of shielding as currently with the dry storage containers. The vault and the trench could provide additional shielding through the internal external walls. And with the trench, there could be some additional shielding with that soil cover that was depicted. Water control is another feature that is absent from the NWMO proposal, particularly post-closure. But for each of these options, there's at least in the case of cask, a very general description, just that it'll be weather tight. The vault's weather tight as well, and providing the access route and the downgrade would provide some protection. And then the cast in shallow trenches, where there would be, I think, a higher concern about the presence of water, they outlined a number of measures that they would use to control, capture that water that was entering into the storage system, or to prevent it from entering into the storage system. And then monitoring is something that is definitely absent from the DGR proposal as currently being presented by the NWMO. They did a number of years ago have a very preliminary outline for monitoring. More recently, they produced a paper about 5 to 8 years ago that was along the lines of towards a framework for monitoring, which said they'll think about monitoring later. The monitoring associated with the extended on-site storage, two different approaches. One, operational monitoring, which is mostly looking at the structures. And each of them identified that there would be a monitoring program in place for that specific structure or facility. And then very importantly, fuel conditioning monitoring. So generically, it says the alternatives would provide the possibility of monitoring the atmosphere local to the fuel bundle containers, and an in-situ monitoring program would be implemented. Interestingly, in this report, they set out an actual target for the amount of monitoring of the actual inventory, the actual waste inventory, in a non-invasive manner, but they set out a certain percentage on a 3-monthly basis for all the storage casks, the vaults, and for the casks in the trench system. And they also identified that repackaging would be done periodically on a longer time frame than storage facility repeats. So I would expect, the detail isn't there. It's not an in-depth report. The detail isn't there, but I would expect that that repackaging would follow from the monitoring program, where they monitor, they measure performance. When they identify an issue, then there would be repackaging. And because all the waste is retrievable, then that would be within the options available. So just as a summary, and again, this is the approach outlined by consultants to the NWMO as part of their requirements set out by the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act in 2002. So the extended on-site storage system provides fuel retrievability, shielding, water control, monitoring, fuel condition monitoring, and repackaging. And it avoids the status quo deficits, some of which we've identified already. It avoids delays before taking any action to respond to these deficits. It avoids transportation, and it avoids the creation of additional nuclear sites. So the paper that Northwatch has prepared, and again, I'm going to stress it's a draft paper, is available now for review to workshop participants. So our motivation was the international failure of geological repository programs, which is also the case with a number of different agencies who have also been researching, developing papers in this topic over the last 20 years. So the continued scientific and technical uncertainties around DGRs and the lack of social acceptance around nuclear waste burial, and the pressing need to improve the current on-site storage of high-level waste at the reactor station. And I will say we're an organization based in Northern Ontario. We don't have nuclear power reactors. And so it's a bit of a surprising circumstance to find that we have spent quite amount of time looking at the way waste is managed at the reactor station. And we do that because the way the waste is managed at the station could have consequences for the long-term fragility of that waste, the condition of that waste over the longer period of time. And also, as we began looking at waste at the reactor station, we identified a number of shortcomings in the way they were being managed, a number of shortcomings which I think put the reactor communities at greater risk than should be the case, and perhaps a greater risk than they recognize as being the case. The approach in the Northwatch paper, it neither relies on or rules out eventual resolution of the technical and social obstacles related to a DGR or some other technical method not yet determined, not yet identified. We've been looking at deep geological repositories since the late 1980s, others longer. And I will say we're not optimistic that these technical uncertainties are going to be resolved in the near future. And we would argue that continuing to delay taking action on the waste, getting the waste into the most secure system possible at the reactor station, continue to delay that because of this notion that there's a deep geological repository somewhere on the near horizon is simply not responsible, simply reckless. So we don't rule out the possibility of a better technical option, but we think it's time to be realistic. It's time to be realist. It's time to say the waste needs to be put into the best, most secure, most robust storage system available, possible at the reactor stations. And there should not be another delay of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, which is the delay that there will be even if the NWMO is successful in securing a site, then a design, then a series of licenses, which will end with the license to abandon. So enough delay. So the parameters that Northwatch would place on this is that as long as the waste continues to be generated, no problem is going to be solved. It's an intractable problem. If the most radioactive waste remains at the site, then we're not really solving the most urgent problem by moving the waste any amount of distance, let alone 1,600 or 2,400 kilometers. The nuclear industry's go-to argument, their defense at the final card they play, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has played this card on industry's behalf, is that we cannot expect that society will continue uninterrupted on surface. And they reference the risk of war, climate catastrophe, social collapse. But as long as they continue to generate waste and have the most radioactive waste at the reactor station, that argument doesn't hold because the largest risk will still be at the reactor station. And certainly if industry and the regulator anticipates social collapse, then what rationale could there be for approving, constructing, operating additional reactors and generating additional waste, which will have to stay on site for many more decades? So as long as the waste continues to be generated, the most dangerous waste will remain on surface at the reactor stations. So the necessary components, the waste must be appropriately categorized. It has to be fully and carefully characterized. The waste have to be inventoried. They must be tracked and labeled. Industry tells us now they know where all their waste is. Well, I would expect nothing less. The waste storage system must be monitored, and the performance of the storage system must be measured for any releases, and that is not the case now, and could not be the case with a deep geological repository. And the waste storage monitoring results must be recorded, made readily available to decision makers, the public, and Indigenous people. Also not the case, very difficult to get monitoring results, even from the limited monitoring that happens at the reactor stations at present. Although there have been some improvements on that. For example, Grant OPG, Ontario Power Generation, now is making groundwater monitoring results available, which was not the case for many years. So that is definitely an improvement. Some key features of a risk-reduced approach. The waste system must be, the waste must be placed in a system that's passively safe. The facility must be hardened, placing layers of concrete, steel, gravel, various combinations. This is something that Dr. Thompson discussed and is certainly included in the hardened on-site storage system that's been endorsed by US environmental and safe energy groups. And the fuel waste storage facilities must be dispersed, another feature of hardened on-site storage. The fuel storage structures are distributed across the site, subject to site conditions, rather than being concentrated in a single area. And this is a risk reduction, it doesn't eliminate the risk, but it reduces the risk if there was an extreme weather event, if there was a loss of, a failure of the structure through that or through malevolent act, if the waste is dispersed and each structure or set of structures are hardened as clusters, then you are reducing risk and you're reducing the volume of release of radioactive releases. So key components, the system must be developed with monitoring as a design fundamental, not an add-on. You design the system based on the need for monitoring. The system must allow measure of performance. So each of the barriers, if there are multiple barriers form the containment system, we have to be able to measure each of those barriers and their performance and identify when there is a failure or a deterioration of that barrier. Prior to failure, when there's a deterioration of that barrier, there must be an ability to access and retrieve the waste packages or the containers in order to respond to those failures, or prior to failure, a deterioration. And then there must be within the system an ability to replace, repair, or re-encapsulate the containers. And that needs to be fundamental, built into the system. It's not just a contingency that could be applied after the fact. It needs to be built into the system. So key principles, proximity principle, which is a principle that is part of radioactive waste policy in Scotland and in Wales, and is part of EU policy for other waste types, toxic waste. So the proximity principle directs that the waste is dealt with as close to its point of generation as is reasonably possible. So in the case of Pickering, as Dr. Thompson suggested, it's not leaving the waste in its current location immediately at the waterfront. It's moving it back north of the reactors, but still in close proximity. And the approach must align with the principles embedded in Canadian environmental law and decision-making, risk and harm reduction, the precautionary principle, polluter pay, and perpetual care. And we have two examples of perpetual care. And this is maybe the toughest part of this approach, is that we have to accept that we are responsible, using the big royal we are responsible for this waste and its management, its care and maintenance into perpetuity. It will not go away. Abandonment is not a solution. We need perpetual care, and there are two different citizens approaches. The first nuclear guardianship was developed in the 1980s. Joanna Macy was at the center of this, and nuclear guardianship at heart, what it requires is a commitment to present and future generations to keep the radioactive materials out of the biosphere, to keep them contained. And Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility adopted an earlier concept of rolling stewardship, which was, I think, first developed for other waste types. And Dr. Edwards and Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility adopted that to nuclear waste. And again, it's that we have a long-term responsibility. We must contain it securely. We can contain it securely for decades at a time, but a rolling stewardship approach means that it's monitored, retrievable, that we can make those repairs, replacements, re-encapsulation. So that's a concept of rolling stewardship, and both of those are perhaps very general approaches to a very technical and practical method that must be developed to support extended on-site storage and more robust storage at the reactor station. So just in summary, looking at comparing these options, extended on-site storage versus a centralized site, whether that's a deep geological repository, or the third option that the NWMO was to look at was centralized storage. So moving it from the reactor stations to a single location, which is something that's being promoted by some in the United States right now, looking at comparing extended on-site storage to centralized site. What's in it for the reactor communities? More immediate risk reduction, improved security for the waste site. It removes the waste from the sight lines and the shorelines of Lake Ontario or Lake Huron in the case of the Western Waste Management Facility, although the Western Waste Management Facility is about 1,000 meters in from the shoreline of Lake Huron, so not quite as extreme as Pickering and Darlington. And it reduces transfers. What's in it for DGR targeted communities and the hundreds of communities along the transportation route, including those reactor communities? They will be on the transportation route to a centralized site, whether that centralized site includes a deep geological repository as centralized storage. It avoids the transportation risk. It avoids the introduction of nuclear risk and radioactive contaminants into a greenfield region, into a new site. So these are some of the resources, and I am going to send those to you in a follow-up email. And I thank you for your patience. I think that I have talked for longer than I intended. I see we've got one question and a number of items in the chat. So I'm going to just ask you in the question and answer period to limit your questions to questions, not comments. Feel free to put those in the chat. Try to keep your questions short and use the upvote in the question and answer to have questions come to the top. And then send any additional questions to Northwatch. And I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to go and open up the question and answer. So we've got one question. Maybe I'll then go look to the chat. So a question from Mary Veltri. When you say no technical case to support a DGR, what does that mean? What kind of evidence would be required to establish the safety of the DGR proposal? So in the siting process, in the impact assessment process, and in the siting process, the NWMO will be required to produce a safety case. There are a number of licensing stages, and the impact assessment will be carried out at the same time as probably just the first, the license to prepare a site. So it's not yet known when the NWMO will actually produce a complete safety case. A safety case is a set of technical arguments which supports the proposal, supports the plan that the NWMO is presenting. Right now, so there's a couple of stages. Right now, the NWMO produced what they called reference cases, over, first it was Ontario Hydro, then Ontario Power Generation, then NWMO, these, binders, proposing a generic concept, and they produced one for sedimentary rock, one for crystalline, after the NWMO took up the file. The last one was in 2018. Now in 2021, they produced what they called some concept reports, which was a set of ideas, but some of these ideas, for example, the used fuel packaging plant, big part of the NWMO plan, is at a concept stage. They still hadn't at that time prepared a full description. It was conceptual and incomplete. And there are parts of the deep geological repository design as well. So they haven't produced a complete plan, complete project description. And that would be the first step. And then the second step would be the technical arguments to support that in a safety case. So that is the documentation that would be required. How those documents will actually establish safety is yet unknown. You know, in the case of Sweden, they submitted their application in 2011 to the Lands and Environment Court, and it has been returned a number of times, and it's 2024. They still don't have an approval, and they have a political approval, but they don't have an approval from the Lands and Environment Court, and that was because of deficiencies in their safety case. In the case of Finland, they submitted a proposal about 14 months ago, and their review period has just been extended by another year because the regulator required additional information from the proponent, from Posiva. So we don't know how long it'll take, and we don't know when we'll see those technical arguments or that kind of evidence, but we're not to the point of evidence. We don't even have a complete description. So next question. Question from Lise. What is the NWMO's response to Dr. Edwards' concerns? I think that the NWMO has acknowledged rolling stewardship as an approach, but they have in essence said that it is not viable in the long term, and they have said that it is not a technical method. That's true, it's not a technical method, but they have not provided, I don't think, a detailed response, and perhaps we'll ask Dr. Edwards, and I'll provide in a follow-up package if he has actually received a response specifically. Mary asks, has the HOS been presented to NWMO? Why do they not favor this? In the 2002-2005 study period, the only rationale they provided is they said that extended on-site storage would be more expensive. Well, they, they have from the beginning said their project would be $16 to $24 billion, and now they've increased that to $26 billion. So I think we'd have to look again at that cost comparison and see how realistic it is, but that was the answer that they gave at the time in their 2002-2005 studies. I think that more realistically, the answer is that the industry has always favored a deep geological repository. They would like to say that the problem of nuclear waste is solved and that they have solved it, and that they then can carry on with additional waste generation. That's my assessment. So a question from Cal. Is there a change in the geological practice or applied engineering underground, such as a recent expansion of fracking in the United States? And what are the protections for underground storage facilities in the future? So this brings us back to stage 2 of the NWMO's 9-step siting process. When they identified candidate areas, initially they did an initial screening in step 2, stage 2. And what they did is they identified areas where there were not any current economic values. And they managed to map out fairly large chunks of area and they had those areas withdrawn. This is in Northern Ontario only, withdrawn from mineral exploration and mineral development and any other land use designations. They did include in the initial screening gas potential and mineral potential. But when you look at how mineral potential has changed over the decades, I don't think in 20, certainly in the 1990s, we weren't identifying lithium as a key target mineral, and now we are. So, but that's the way they identified areas. And I don't think that there is a method by which they have identified that future land uses or future mineral exploration would not be potentially put an underground, a buried waste volume at risk. They say they'll do that with signage and so on. So I think it's a vulnerability. Question from Wendy. Does the NWMO ever address social acceptability of their DGR proposal? I ask because if measures are taken that are not socially acceptable, safety issues may be engendered, distrust, loss of faith in authority, civil disobedience, and other collateral damage. I think we all have heard the refrain from the NWMO that they will only proceed with an informed and willing host. Challenges there, given that it's difficult for a community, the public, to be informed when the NWMO has not presented a full proposal, and difficult to measure willingness when the NWMO excluded that from their citing methodology. And so there is no methodology that they must follow, even by their own rules, for measuring or determining willingness. So we've got different approaches. There are only two communities, two municipalities who first engaged with the NWMO of the 22, two remain, and they are both using different methods to measure, but in both cases, ultimately, it's potentially council decisions. South Bruce, if they are committed to a referendum, but if the referendum, if they don't have the voter turnout required, then it defaults to council. And in Ignace, which is the proxy decision maker in Northwestern Ontario, it will be, there's some polls and interviews being done by a consultant, will be reported to a committee. The committee will make a recommendation to council, and council will decide. So that's it in terms of what the NWMO has said so far, is they'll only proceed with an informed and willing host. But we can see by observation of the way their process is carrying out that is not very tangible. A question from John. How should we be responding to the current approval of radioactive waste facility near the Ottawa River? So this is the near surface disposal facility for waste, so-called low waste, and mostly non-fission waste. And we should be responding by supporting Kebowak First Nation and the other Algonquin nations who are objecting. And we should be supporting the citizens groups who are have mounted a court challenge that's Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County and area, Ralliement, and Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. So we should be, expressing that support, continuing to put pressure on the federal government, who are the decision makers. They're the ultimate decision makers. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has issued a license. Now it moves to government to rectify that. Question from Erwin, what response has Northwatch received to its proposal? Is there a dialogue? The dialogue, Erwin, has mostly been in workshops. We present this in a much more summary fashion when we do workshops in communities, and we've done workshops in all of the northern communities. Of the 22 communities, the 19 in Ontario, we've done workshops in 18 of them, and all of the ones in Northern Ontario, and the response has been positive. But this is the first time that we're workshopping it with a larger group. We've received no response from Natural Resources Canada, no response from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, no response from the Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development, who we did present it to. So I'd say we're receiving positive response when we present it in workshops in communities, but what we'd like is some feedback, some input. We'd actually like some critical response, and so maybe that's waiting for us in the chat, or maybe we'll get it in the feedback to follow. Question from Lise. Were you able to present to Thunder Bay Council? Northwatch has not presented to Thunder Bay Council. Yesterday, we, the Nuclear Free North and Environment North presented, and in December, Nuclear Free Thunder Bay presented. I think they had a lot of public support for those. I think some questions, some interest from councillors. I wasn't able to attend yesterday, but I'm in North Bay. It was in Thunder Bay. But I think we'll see what the response is when we get a decision from the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee on whether they support the proximity principle or not. Are there technical problems, John asked? Are there technical problems with the proposal? I think with extended on-site storage, what there are there technical gaps. Certainly in Northwatch's paper, it is not a technical paper. I've laid out the basics of it. So there are technical gaps. I think Dr. Thompson has done some work. There is some technical options presented in the paper contracted by the NWMO, but I think there are technical gaps. Those problems, I think, whether they're problems or just gaps, deficiencies, and certainly there will be challenges, particularly on Pickering, where it's a small site. I think there will be challenges. And then there's questions about, over the long term, maintaining that guardianship, maintaining that, that monitoring and response, including maintaining nuclear expertise. And I think that looking forward, I expect nuclear power to be phased out, and that might bring new people into the field. That might bring new people into the sector, people who are interested in solving the problem and safeguarding the waste. But I think those are some of the technical challenges. And certainly the technical details are beyond the scope of Northwatch's work, but some things that we would like to work with others to build in. And Kim asked if there was a good turnout at the recent protests at the Hill. I'm sorry, Kim, I can't ask. Maybe somebody can answer that in chat. Lorraine asked if she missed a question about seismic activity in the site area. There has been recent seismic activity in the siting in the candidate site in the Northwest. And I believe that there is some seismic risk has been identified associated with the Darlington site, but I don't have the details on that. But there has been recent seismic activity in the vicinity of the Rebel site in Northwestern Ontario, about halfway between Ignis and Dryden, that site, candidate site. So most significantly at Megaguist Lake, Mamaguist Lake, a few weeks ago, there was some fairly significant activity. So Cal asks, in Eastern Ontario, there's a wide-ranging billboard sign campaign. Many of them here hand-painted against an asphalt site plant in their area. Permanent advertising, very funny. I believe a successful campaign. Can we do anything similar? There are a number of billboards in the Northwest. mostly in the vicinity of, mostly between Ignace and Dryden. And there are plans for additional billboards as soon as the ground thaws this spring. So at least 3, and the groups in that area also have a lot of lawn signs available. So yeah, great idea, Cal. I feel that we keep swaying from extended on-site storage, but I understand the interest is in nuclear waste more generally, including these candidate sites. A question from Janice. Now that different sources such as Professor Jacobson from Stanford, David Suzuki, around renewables and alternatives to nuclear, they say that we can go without nuclear phase out. A nuclear phase out is certainly possible. Why do you think both the Liberals and Conservatives want to continue with more nuclear generating stations? It doesn't make financial health or safety sense. So that is an excellent question, Janice. Again, not about extended on-site storage. I think it's institutional. I think that there is a powerful lobby. I think that nuclear construction is a very lucrative industry, a lucrative business. And I think that there's a powerful lobby, and I think that there is an institutional commitment within government. And there are other players that, that also have economic interests in continuing nuclear power. So I think it's an institutional issue. And I think that the federal government and the provincial government need to hear from people more. And so that's something that I think we're all going to have to take up. Kevin asks, it's become clear a few years down the line that climate collapse is accelerating and long-term human stewardship will no longer be feasible. Is there a fail-safe scenario to minimize risk? Well, the best scenario is to stop producing it. If we are 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, 100 years from social collapse, then we need to stop generating the waste and we need to move it into more secure, more robust storage as rapidly as possible. It's going to be 10 to 30 years from the point that the last reactor operates before the waste can move into dry storage, even at site. So that's it's not fail safe. There's nothing fail safe. But that is that's the immediate scenario. Renee asks, what about silo storage for New Brunswick? Silo storage, like the dry storage, I'm not familiar with the New Brunswick sites at all. Perhaps some on the line who are from New Brunswick can help out with that. But I think the silo storage in New Brunswick would probably fall into the same category as the dry storage containers in Ontario, in that we can't really speak to their security because we haven't had the ability to do an actual independent technical review of those storage systems. So we can't speak to them. I certainly can't speak to them. So I think that we're at the end of our question period and we're at 8:23. And I think that there's lots of comments in the chat. And I think we should say goodnight. So I really appreciate we've got, a large group of people have stayed on the line through this long presentation with a single presenter, no moderator. And I think that that's a challenge. So thank you very much. And your homework will be coming in the email. And I really appreciate your spending the time and then spending the time in follow-up to give us some feedback and really look at it from your perspective, whether that's a social perspective, a technical perspective. Tell us what you think needs more work. Identify additional resources that we can apply, and we would really like to see this develop further as we go forward. Really, the time is now. So thank you all very much. It's been my pleasure to spend this evening with you. Thank you. Good night.